Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Our today's topic is main difference classical with modern tragedy. A tragedy can be defined simply as a play that has a sad and depressing ending. Although both classical and modern tragedy have a tragic ending, there are several differences between them. The main difference between classical and modern tragedy is that classical tragedy have a unified plot with one royal or noble protagonist, whereas modern tragedies features ordinary people with realistic problems. What is a classical tragedy? Tragedy is a popular form of drama that originated from Greek literary tradition. Aristotle defined as a unified work that covers one time span, story, setting, and a main protagonist. The plot of the drama consists of one great complete action. The protagonist of classical tragedy is typically from a royal or noble family. Antigone, Oedipus, and Agamemnon are some examples of protagonists in classical tragedies. These brave and noble heroes often face a reversal of fortune. This reversal is typically due to a tragic flaw in the character and the influence of a divine power. Fate also plays a major role in classical tragedies. Some examples of classical tragedies include Oedipus Rex, Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, Medea, Antigone, and Prometheus Bound. Given below some element of a classical tragedy. अच्छा तो फर्स्ट एलिमेंट है हिमार्शिया. A mistake or a fault that is committed in ignorance. This is usually a mistake made by a morally good person. Hubris. The false pride that leads to ruin. This is the opposite of rectitude. Prepatia. The reversal of fortune. Catharsis. Feeling of emotional release felt at the end of the tragedy. Main difference classical with modern tragedy. Okay, what is modern tragedy? Modern tragedy refers to the tragedies that were written and performed from the 20th century. Some examples of modern tragedy include Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, A View from the Bridge, The Misfit, and David Mamet's Glengarry, Glen Rose are some examples of modern tragedy. Unlike classical tragedies, modern tragedies are typically centered around the ordinary people and their problem. Thus, they are more realistic than classical tragedies. The conflict in modern tragedies are caused by flaw in the characters, society, or the law. Fate and divine power do not play a major role in modern tragedies. Modern tragedy may also have multiple plots and more than one central character. The action in the story may also span several weeks, months, or years. The difference in time is managed by elements such as flashbacks, pauses, flash forward, and narration. Modern playwrights also use elements such as irony and sarcasm to highlight the flaws in characters. Difference between modern and classical tragedy. तो क्लासिकल ट्रेजिडी के करेक्टर कैसे हैं? क्लासिकल ट्रेजिडी के करेक्टर में क्लासिकल ट्रेजिडी टिपिकली हैव वन मैन करेक्टर. मॉडर्न ट्रेजिडीज में हैव मोर देन वन सेंट्रल करेक्टर. प्रोटोगोनिस्ट क्लासिकल ट्रेजिडी का प्रोटोगोनिस्ट इज टिपिकली फ्रॉम अ वेल्दी नोबल और रॉयल फैमिली. मॉडर्न ट्रेजिडी का प्रोटोगोनिस्ट कैसे होता है? प्रोटोगोनिस्ट यूजली हैज अ कॉमन मिडिल क्लास बैकग्राउंड. नेचर ऑफ प्रोटोगोनिस्ट इन क्लासिकल ट्रेजिडीज. द प्रोटोगोनिस्ट इज यूजली अ नोबल एंड हीरोइक कैरेक्टर बट हैज अ ट्रेजिक फ्लो. मॉडर्न ट्रेजिडी का जो प्रोटोगोनिस्ट है उसकी नेचर कैसी है? द प्रोटोगोनिस्ट मे बी अ वाइट, ब्लैक और ग्रे कैरेक्टर. Plot classical tragedy. Classical tragedies have one unified plot. Modern tragedies may have multiple plots. Timeline classical tragedy की क्या है? Classical tragedies have one time span. अब आ जाती है modern tragedy की timeline. Modern tragedy have more realistic time spans. There are break and flashbacks. Story. Classical tragedy में story कैसी होती है? The story is about nobility or royalty, their ambitions, attempt to unify or save a kingdom, etc. Modern tragedy. The story is about ordinary people and their problems, ambition, and aspiration. Thus, the stories are more realistic. Elements. Classical tragedy. Classical tragedies typically contains elements such as hubris, hamartia, and catharsis. Modern tragedy. Modern tragedies use elements like irony and sarcasm. Fate and divine power. क्लासिकल ट्रेजिडी में किस तरह से फेट एंड डिवाइन पावर होती है? फेट एंड डिवाइन पावर आर important element in classical tragedy. Modern tragedy. Fate and divine power rarely play a role in modern tragedy. They have more concerned with realistic common problems. Okay, so it is all about the modernist classical tragedy. At the end of the video, I have to request you, please pray for my mother. May Allah grant her to the highest level of Jannah. Ameen summa ameen. And stay recite the Pak sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Rabbana khfirli wa li walidayya. And do subscribe my channel, support my channel and myself also, because your support is my strength.